You are live.
Okay, awesome. Amazing technology. So hi everyone. It sounds like we've gone live onto YouTube. And my name is Heather Barrett. I'm the Science Communication Director and one of the research scientists for Sea Otter Savvy. And I am honored that State Parks asked me to be here today to talk to you guys about the southern sea otter, give you guys a little bit of background information. We're gonna do some myth busting as well. Yeah, and I'm just excited to get started. So the first thing, I'm actually going to turn off my video so my floating head isn't part of your screen anymore. And that way you can just focus on the sea otters if I can figure out how to, there we go. Okay, so one of the first things I just wanted to say is that I'm thrilled to be here, especially for Biodiversity Week. I'm sure you guys have had some of this information before, but I wanted to highlight that California truly is the most biodiverse state in the continental US. And there are over 40,000 different plant and animal species. And it's partly due to the fact that we have so many unique and different ecosystems in our one state. So like in one day, you could be in grasslands and then you could be up in the redwoods, or you could be oak woodland and then end up in the desert. So it's just an amazing state and our biodiversity is incredible. And one of my favorite parts is that it includes the southern sea otter, which is a keystone species, and they actually promote biodiversity. So it seems really fitting that we're able to talk about them during this week. And so just to give you a brief overview about some of the, something bad just happened. Oh no, my PowerPoint just gave out. So technical difficulties, everyone. I'm trying to get this back up and running. I don't know if Mariana, you can hear me anymore.
We can hear you.
Okay, I'm sorry guys, that just disappeared. Everything disappeared. Let me let's see if I can't. Where did it go? Oh no. Okay. Let's try to reopen this. Of course, there's got to be something, right? Slideshow. Let me just move this.
It happens.
Yeah, sorry guys, that was embarrassing. Oh no. All right, computer, hold yourself together. All right, hopefully everyone now, Mariana, can you just see the one screen? Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay, good. Sorry guys. All right, well, I wanted to tell you guys that I had an overview about some of the information. We actually have a lot of information we're going to be covering today, and I just took snippets out of all of it. There's so much to know about sea otters, but these are just some of the main categories to go through that I thought would be most interesting for you all. And then we're going to kind of end with a little bit of information on sea otters and humans and how that sort of interaction goes. But at the end of this, you guys are going to be sea otter experts and up to date with all your sea otter info. So to start, I always like to begin with classification. So first off, on that right side, you can see that sea otters are depicted as they're a recent addition to the marine environment. So they do not have a long evolution timeline. Like when you look at the whales, it's about 50 million years. Sea otters, it's about 1.6 million. And that sort of gives you a sense that they have some adaptations for the marine environment, but they potentially are not going to have the same adaptations as whales, and then of course sea lions and pinnipeds like that. They are also of the mustelid family. I love it. These are the weasels. And so I actually like to call them sea weasels for sea otters, just because it gives you a good sense of what type of personality they might have. So if you think of a weasel, they definitely have a big attitude, they're pugnacious, they have lots of energy, and that all fits for sea otters as well. And then I wanted to make sure everyone knows that there are actually 3 recognized subspecies of sea otters. You have the Asian sea otter, you have the northern sea otter, and then we have the southern sea otter, which is basically the area that we have in sort of central and southern California. And we're going to look at where those ranges are in just a moment. So some of the important background for sea otters too that we have to touch on, especially if we are discussing range and habitat, is that in the early 1700s, so worldwide population for sea otters was estimated. It's hard to know exact numbers. No one was really looking at that then, but they're about 150 to 300,000 individuals. And it really was following the arrival of the Alaskan Russian explorers in the mid 1700s. And of course, with the fur trade, that extensive harvesting of sea otters for fur over the next, 150 years resulted in the near extirpation of the species. So it wasn't until about 1911, when sea otters were afforded the protection by the International Fur Seal Treaty, that there was probably only about 2,000 individuals left, and they were broken, they were fragmented into these 13 remnant colonies. So you can see in that map, that black line would have been historically where they should have continued, right? And so you can see where the Asian sea otter would have been over there in Hokkaido, and then you have the Aleutian Isles down through Alaska's the northern sea otter. And basically what we're left with for California is we have the southern sea otter, and in 1911 it would have just been right off that area of Big Sur. So now we're going to be looking at current range, and that's in yellow, and you can still see the historic range in red. And I've actually highlighted the southern sea otters range to the right, kind of pulled that out. And the southern sea otter's current range extends from Gaviota, kind of near Santa Barbara, a little bit around Santa Barbara area, a little north of that, all the way up to Pigeon Point. That's a little bit north of Año Nuevo State Park. And so the heat map is showing you density, okay? So the red zones are areas with the highest number of sea otters, so those are gonna be higher populations, versus the yellow areas, it's probably less otters per square mile. And then the current California sea otter population is approximately about 3,000 individuals. Total sea otter population across all three of those subspecies is about 125,000. So that gives you guys a little bit of background about their history and also where we find them. But if we want to talk a little bit more about home range, which is a little bit more specific to individuals, the main thing to note is that sea otters are locals. Okay, so they're practically your neighbors. They don't go very far. It's not that they can't, but they generally live relatively in shallow coastal waters. Okay, so that 50 to 75 foot depth, and that's mainly because that's where their food's going to be, and that's how deep they usually dive. And they tend to stay within about 1 kilometer offshore, and they're found in areas generally with some protection from severe ocean winds. So they like the rocky coastlines, thick kelp forests. And sometimes they'll be found up in estuaries. But the one thing I wanted to touch on is that you definitely have, females tend to be site specific, and they're also constrained by reproduction. So an example here is a young female that was off of Arroyo Laguna. Her number was 7792. And her home range, you can see in all those little blue dots, was not that extensive. She generally stayed in the same area. And this really brings the important note that females are constrained by reproduction and their energetic costs. Okay, so it's expensive to be a sea otter mom, and so you're going to be really more focused on about staying where the food is than necessarily exploring new habitats. And so that's one of the reasons why sea otters end up being locals. Which also brings me to another key habitat that people like to think like, well, do sea otters use land? And so if sea otters are on land or on shore, does that mean that they're sick? And so this brings us to our first sort of fact versus fiction, the concept, are sea otters onshore sick? And I think the main thing to note is that land is a critical part of their habitat, and it's actually often overlooked. So now it's true that certain injured or ill or even older animals may tend to seek areas that are calm and warm, but even healthy otters benefit from hauling out as well. So as we designate more areas for wildlife and we reduce human traffic in certain coastal areas, we actually begin to see that otters actively do come ashore and rest, warm up. And you can see even with these guys, sometimes they can even interact with each other. We've even had, visuals of them running down the beach. So although sightings weren't necessarily as common before, it's perhaps a reason of us and not necessarily it's not a critical habitat for them. We actually assume that it's healthy for them to come up and warm up that way. Females have been observed hauling out in Elkhorn Slough with pups on the pickleweed, and it isn't uncommon for them to actually leave some of the pups on docks. So they'll find other areas that seem flat where they can put a pup and then they can keep foraging. And it's just a way for them to get their pup out of the cold water. So for a species that is, constantly trying to stay warm, it's not surprising that they try to haul out and sunbathe a bit. But with that said, it is an important habitat for also those that are sick and injured. It's one way that they can make sure that they heal or warm up quickly instead of being in the cold water. So I'll go into the physical description. So this is pretty easy for everyone, but sea otters are, again, big weasels. They are actually the heaviest weasel, and they do have flippers. So they do have webbing on the back part of their feet, and they're actually the only mammal with paws in the front and flippers in the back. and they have that thick brown fur that they were hunted for. And they can actually have lighter tones towards the face and on the chest. And we actually call that grizzle. And so this brings me to another fact versus fiction, or some questions that I generally get from people is, can you age a sea otter by that graying or that grizzle? So although sea otters are usually dark brown and some individuals may become progressively lighter or that grizzling, right, on the chest, head, forearms, this is due to loss of the pigmentation in the guard hairs. And so the extent at which they become grizzled can be related to age, but it's also related to genetics. So it's not clear cut. Some are going to remain dark. Some are going to be more of that blonde coloring like that one in the middle, and others have sort of a more striking silver look to them, but it's generally not a good marker of age. And the reason is because I like to think of Steve. He went silver in his mid-30s. So I mean, it would be inappropriate for me to age him if he's in his mid-30s. So, grizzle is specific to an individual, but it is an interesting thing to see. You can start to see even pups, younger pups actually start off a little blonder than others as well. Okay, so now I'm going to get a little bit into the adaptations. And so I want you guys to remember that it's really difficult. Could you imagine surviving in the ocean as a mammal, right? So for a marine mammal, there are important adaptations that they have to have. And being recent additions, right? Sea otters don't necessarily have as long of that timeline as cetaceans or whales, like we talked about before. And so sea otters have this dilemma. So they don't store fat as blubber, because one of the main things that you need to think about if you're a mammal in the ocean is that you have to stay warm. Okay, we have our internal temperatures that we have to maintain. So if they're not storing fat as blubber, what are they doing? Well, instead of the blubber for insulation, they have their extremely thick fur. And so that thick fur can actually hold warm air. So in fact, they actually, in certain parts of their body, they can have up to about 1 million hairs per square inch. They are considered to be, they have the thickest fur of any mammal. And the truth is, this really depends on the body location, okay? So as certain areas do have less per square inch, others can get up to 1 million per square inch, and other areas actually lack hair altogether, like the nose, the paws. So those are the exposed skin areas. And that's one of the areas where they're going to lose heat. And so sometimes you'll see sea otters cover their eyes with their paws. And it's one of the ways, one of their behaviors of being able to help keep heat in. And so one thing, this is just a blow up picture of one of the fur. You can actually see that their fur is consisting of 2 different types. You have the interlocking underfur, which is what this photo is. And you can see the little sort of hook or barb. These actually can connect, and then they can blow warm air as they're grooming in, and that holds that air system, sort of a layer of air next to their skin. So when they are really truly well groomed, their skin does not come into contact with seawater. And then their other hair, which is that guard hair, is the longer one, and that helps water run off the coat. So it also helps protect it so it doesn't get into that air pocket. And so this is why grooming for them is so important. And they actually spend considerable amounts of their day just making sure that they're got warm air against their skin. And this is just an infrared video that I wanted to give you all a sense of how much heat a sea otter loses to the cold water, and also to give you an idea of how hot they're running. Okay, so sea otters have the highest mass specific metabolic rate of any marine mammal. So for their size, they are burning really, really warm. And it's because they're living in such a cold environment that they have to do that. And you can actually see the heat trail and the areas where they're losing the most heat, right? That's going to be the areas without the fur, so the eyes, you can see the paws, the nose. And so this is just to give you a sense of how much energy they are using just to survive in the cold marine environment. So now we're going to touch a little bit on sort of reproduction, males versus females. People always have a lot of questions about these two. So females are generally smaller than males, about 35 to 60 pounds. It's kind of a wide range, 15 to 20 year lifespan. And their metabolic cost actually doubles during reproduction. So it's extremely expensive to be a sea otter mom. So she puts a lot of energy into that pup. And so females generally have 1 pup per year, and it can happen in any season. So it's not like it's a particular season for sea otters. Now, males, they can be up to 90 pounds. That's a big male for a southern sea otter. And they tend to have a little bit lower of a lifespan, up to 15 years. And then they generally have sort of 2 different types. You have bachelors and territorial males. Bachelor males are the ones that are generally younger, or maybe they're older and can no longer hold a territory. But they're sort of on more of the outskirts of the rafts that you would see. They'd be further out, or sometimes bachelors can actually raft together. We have a raft in Moss Landing of bachelors. And then the territorial male would end up having an area that they sort of monitor, and then there'd be females that kind of go throughout that area. So those are the two different strategies for males. And then here, this is one of people's favorite ones, is pups. So pups, like I mentioned before, they can be born at any time of year. Though, I mean, obviously you can imagine it depends on female success of the last pup. So it's really dependent on when she goes into estrus and when a male ends up finding her. But pups are completely reliant on their mothers at birth. And on average, they're with their mom for about 6 months. They nurse for about 2 to 3 months on milk, and that's actually, it has high fat percentage, about 20 to 25%. And the mom will actually begin to offer small bits of pre-cracked food probably about after 3 weeks. And then they actually begin to eat bits of solid food on their own at the 6 to 8 week mark. Twins are possible. That is a question that people ask, but they are extremely rare. And you have to remember that, because remember, we just said that female sea otters, their metabolic rate doubles during pup care and lactation. They ultimately can only care for one. She does not have the energy to care for two. So she's energetically constrained. The natal fur, that pup fur, is extremely dense, even more so than mom's. And so they almost kind of look like little plushies or little baby Einsteins, if you can imagine that, and allows mom to blow warm air into that fur. So they become extremely poofy. They become extremely buoyant. They're kind of like corks on the top of the water. But this means that they can't dive under the water until that adult fur begins to come in. So as their natal fur goes and their adult fur comes in, there's this transition stage. And so they really aren't successfully able to get under, at least for 5 seconds, until about that 8.5 week mark. And that's really when their coat is going to begin to shed and become more adult fur. But this brings in questions. People always wonder, well, so do sea otters learn to dive because mom forces them to? Does she drag them under? And the answer to that is, so as I just sort of mentioned, pups are really constrained by their pup coat, right? So until they are less buoyant, getting under is practically impossible, or then very difficult. And the truth is, mom's really busy, pups are curious, and you can watch as pups actually attempt to dive and follow mom. So she's going to be focused on food. And there's a point at which the pup wants to be with mom, and you can kind of see them attempt to get under, and they're kind of splashing at the surface. And it will take that time before that fur changes that they're actually going to be able to get under the water. So what people may have seen, if they did see a mom grab a pup and drag them under the water, was most likely an older pup, one that did not have as much buoyant fur. It would even be difficult for her to pull them down. But if they did see something like that, it's usually, it's not necessarily her forcing to teach how to dive for foraging. It might be that she's grabbing that pup and diving underwater to escape what she's perceiving as a threat. So if there's a predator, or even if people get too close, and this tends to be a sign of distress. So this is not something we consider a foraging dive or a learning curve. This is more, oh no, we gotta go. And she's gonna grab her pup and dive under. If it's a really young pup, sometimes they can't even do that. So you'll see the mom just put the young pup on her belly because she can't get under. And so she has to swim. And that, again, is a lot of energy. So if you ever see a mom with a pup working really hard to swim fast, try to give her a wide berth. We want to make sure that we're not disrupting them and giving them the chance that they need to rest. Okay, so now a little bit into behavior. So this hopefully isn't a surprise for anyone, but sea otters are highly associated with kelp and eelgrass, depending on their habitat, if it's open bay or estuary. And they use kelp or eelgrass as an anchor. Okay, so that's anchored at the bottom, and then if they're wrapped in it, they can't float away. So you can actually see how this otter uses its teeth to grab a corner and then actually begin to roll. But from this fact, there are others that have sort of emerged over time. And so some of those are that sea otters hold hands so they don't float away, and that sea otters wrap their pups in kelp. And so let's just touch on those for a second. So the hand holding slide. This is a common misconception, is that sea otters hold hands so they don't float away. And this is sort of exploded through social media, art, cartoons, found in artsy fact books. So I feel bad, I might be bursting some people's bubbles. But the reality is this is not a common behavior across the species, okay? That yes, certain individuals, sea otters, can hold hands. It has been documented a few times in aquariums. Those are in-house otters, and a few occurrences in the wild, but it is rare. It is not a daily occurrence, and it's likely a learned behavior for a few individuals rather than what we would call a sea otter fact for the whole population. So sea otters fact would be that they wrap in kelp so they remain anchored. So the thing is, like, if it was considered a true sea otter behavior, we would see this almost every time. You would walk up to a raft of sea otters and you'd have 20 sea otters holding hands, and you don't see that. So that's just a distinction to make, is that it's possible they can. Is this something that we see and consider a fact? No. The next one is that do sea otters wrap their pups in kelp? And so this is sort of misconceived from the fact that we say, okay, sea otters wrap themselves in kelp, but do mothers wrap their pups? And so it's not a huge distinction, but it's nice to clarify. So again, technically possible, but generally a resting mother was just going to hold them on her stomach. So it will rest on her stomach if it's small pup, or it puts them in a choke hold, kind of how the photo you see here for an older pup. Now, if the mother wants to groom or is diving nearby, they'll simply just set the pup in kelp, almost kind of like a bassinet. You just like set them on top of it. Especially if they're sleeping, you're not going to wake up the pup to then wrap them, because to do that would definitely wake up the pup. So if anything, you may see a pup, especially if it's older and it does have a little bit more control over its head and limbs, attempt to start playing with the kelp, chewing on it, watching mom trying to copy, but it's not the mother actually wrapping the pup in kelp. So another thing to talk about behavior is just activity budgets, okay? So they have a wide variety of different behaviors. And what is particularly unique is how they spend their day doing them. So a good motto I like to have is that sea otters groom, they eat, they groom, they sleep, they groom, and then that all repeats. And of course, there's some miscellaneous interactions or other behaviors that mix in there as well. But when you actually break this down into the budget, like what they're doing every day, we find that they end up being resting over 38%, about 38%, and feeding over 30% on average. So you can imagine that's a lot of time resting, and that's a lot of food. And so these are strategies that they have because they are so energetically constrained, and they're focusing on intake of energy and reducing output of energy, why feeding and resting is so important. The grooming is also high just because the reason almost every behavior is sandwiched in between grooming is you really want to make sure that insulation is still doing well. You want to make sure that air bubble is always going to be there, because if cold water hits that skin, you're going to lose so much more heat. And I just want to point out that these are just averages, and this is really specific to Monterey, but this is also just for a 24-hour period. Which brings me to, if we're talking about how much they're eating and if they're foraging, if they're going out there and trying to eat for over 30% of their day, that's a lot of food. And so sea otters prey on a variety of different invertebrates, that basically is animals with its spines. And they generally forage close to shore. Depths tend to be about 60 feet or shallower. And the average time is about a minute. Though the longest dive that was held by a male was about 7.9 minutes. So they can dive longer, but the average is about a minute. And, what you're choosing to eat, influences this dive for the animal, right? So if you're shallower, you can probably stay under longer and you can really dig for something. Or if you wanted something that's really deep, you probably can't dive as long. So there are definitely trade-offs, okay? And so with this trade-offs, there are lots of different types of prey specialists that they can have. But the other thing I skipped over one was sea otters are 24-hour foragers. So something people don't actually realize is that doesn't matter if it's night or day, they are not constrained by daylight, okay? So they actually don't have the best eyesight, but their touch and their paws and their whiskers are a critical sense when foraging. And so they can actually go down at night and they'll find everything with their whiskers and their paws. And that, yeah, so this is a fact that definitely people hear a lot. They are consuming approximately about a quarter of their body weight each day. And that's, again, just to keep that energetic cost, metabolism stoked. And we break them down into sort of 5 prey specialist or foraging types in California. So there's the crab, abalone, mussel, sea snails, and clam sort of categories. And this means that an individual is going to specialize in that group, okay? And they're going to become a master of it. It doesn't mean they can't eat a few other things that are different. It just means a majority of what they're focusing on is going to be this. And The reason that's important is because if you become a master, if you specialize in this, it allows them to save time, right? Everything's about time and effort when it comes to if you have an energetic cost and you're at a limit. So if you're saving time, then you can eat more, right? So the last thing is that certain individuals that are specialized for snails, clams, and mussels can even be seen to be used tools. Which brings into a question that people ask is, do sea otters have a favorite rock for life? So let's chat about that for a second. Now, it's unlikely. Well, I guess the first thing to consider is you think about how you would study this, okay? So, and what would be the reason? Why would a sea otter realistically carry a rock every day, all day, especially if it's heavy, and they are energetically constrained? So we do know that sea otters can use rocks as tools, and that the type and frequency of tool use varies, across the populations. And it is possible that there's preference to shape and size. Maybe someone likes something more angular, someone likes it more flat. And it has been documented that they will put a rock in their pocket during a foraging bout. And so what that means is, I almost like to think you're sitting at a dinner table and you have your fork, okay? So if that's your foraging bout, is your dinner time, you're gonna use your fork during that whole time. You might put your fork down, you might keep it with you, you're gonna keep eating with it. But once your dinner's done, once that foraging bout's done, that fork goes, well, we put it in the kitchen or, wash it and all of that. For them, they're probably just going to drop it at the bottom. So they'll keep it with them while you're eating, but when you're not eating, you're not going to go sleep with your fork. So, however, there's really no indication that they're really keeping them after they're done eating. And the one thing to think about is just, it would be heavy. It would just cost a lot. It would be frustrating, I'm sure, to keep a rock in your pocket in that sort of flabby skin next to their armpit. So that's just, there is possible, though, that they could be foraging in the same area and maybe pick up the same rock the next time, but it would be really difficult to study. Okay, now this one's really important. So this is ecological implications. And one of the reasons I think talking about sea otters for Biodiversity Week is so important. So we've talked that sea otters are good eaters, voracious appetites. They have to stoke that flame of all that metabolism that they have to go through. So all of this has an ecological implication. So sea otters are considered a keystone species. And this means that they are an organism or an animal that has a huge effect on their community. It ends up being disproportionate to their abundance. And this term actually comes from architecture. So the keystone is that center stone, and it's putting pressure on the supporting stones on the side. And so those are actually putting pressure upwards as well. So all together, they create an arch. But when that keystone ends up being removed, the remaining stones fall. And so this ends up being an analogy that with, an ecological community, it ends up being altered. So those interactions may disappear, they may change. And it's really because they consume such large quantities of marine invertebrates. Sea otters keep the nearshore ecosystems in balance, right? So they're enhancing not only the kelp forest, but they're also enhancing eelgrass beds. Right, and kelp forests provide numerous direct and indirect benefits, including habitat for hundreds of other different species. It can help with reductions in coastal erosion, carbon storage, and can theoretically help moderate climate change. So seagrasses also provide important benefits, such as nursery habitat for many other species, shoreline protection, and carbon sequestration as well. So really, we like to consider sea otters as our ecosystem superheroes. Which brings me to a little bit about their status. So just so everyone knows that southern sea otter is listed under the Endangered Species Act as threatened. And it's really because of the reduced range and population size, and they are vulnerable to oil spills and coastal tanker traffic, especially because they rely so heavily on their fur, right? So if there was an oil spill, that would drastically impact the population. But sea otters are also protected under the Marine Mammal Protection Act, and it protects all marine mammals in US waters. In 1994, there was actually an amendment that protects them against harassment, which is kind of where I kind of want to end this and discuss a little bit more about what that means. And essentially, protecting against harassment or disturbance is stating the fact that any sort of behavior that you do or anything that you do that might impact or change their behaviors, okay? And so this brings us to the ending sort of concept of sea otters and humans. And so we're going to end with the fact that this, again, shouldn't be surprising. People love sea otters. And they tend to have this description of cute and cuddly, and it really drives people to want to interact and get really, really close to them. And so this isn't necessarily fact versus fiction, but I thought it was an important thing to touch on. It is subjective. Sea otters generally are considered cute and cuddly, but it is a perception, and it's not necessarily a truly accurate description of the species. It leaves people unaware and sort of assuming sea otters are friendly, when in reality, remember, they are large weasels and they are wild. And so they have an appearance that we term as cute, but you might want to cuddle with them, but it's not a good idea. I actually like to think of them as kelp grizzlies, okay? They do have, attitudes, they're territorial, they can be aggressive. In certain cases, they could be dangerous. And so it's important that no one, never approach or feed a sea otter. This is for your safety as well as theirs. And then the other thing that comes up sometimes is sea otters are curious, right? And so then it comes up to the question of people like, well, it came up to me, so it must be okay, right, that we had this interaction. And again, this is sort of nuanced, but if a sea otter initiates an interaction, is it okay to participate? The truth is, this is a tough, right? Because they are curious, they are mammals. And you can imagine that, if 100 people started showing up at your door, you'd probably be curious and wonder what they are doing there, and sort of test out the boundaries and explore. But the truth is, we know better. We know it is our responsibility to keep boundaries, and that's for their protection, right? So allowing an interaction to continue, it still violates that Protection Act. So because it encourages potentially dangerous behaviors and changes and alters their natural behaviors. And this is something they can learn over time. If they're allowed to get on a kayak one time, that sea otter is probably going to try to get on another kayak another time. So in those instances where that happens, we really want people to remember, please help them stay wild. They don't know better, but we do. And it's actually really hard for a sea otter to climb on a kayak. Trust me, it takes multiple attempts. So that person is watching them attempt to climb on the kayak if it happens. So in those instances, if you had an amazing opportunity where a sea otter swims by close to you and wants to interact, you just say like, well, isn't that special? And you keep paddling. And if they do try to climb up in your kayak, it's okay. You just gently, stop them from getting on the kayak, and you just paddle away and know that you had a really cool up close encounter, but you were responsible in viewing them. And it's for your safety as well as theirs. And so there are instances where if people get close to an otter that they thought was habituated or wanted to come say hi, but it gets startled, you can still, they can definitely do damage. They have strong jaws and sharp teeth. And the last thing, I want to bring into is this concept of our coastal areas. There's only so much space, right? So as we increase in population, as tourism increases, and it's very exciting, we love to know that people are recreating outdoors and wanting to have these viewings of wildlife. But it is something to consider that when we all do it at once and there's an only limited amount of space, it becomes difficult. And we actually have learned through, my research with Sea Otter Savvy, is that disturbance does increase their energetic cost. So we've touched on how important it is for them to maintain their energy balance. And the truth is, if they're resting and a whole bunch of kayaks come through and startle them and they have to go back under the water, that means they have to find more food to make up for that cost, right? And so really, distance does matter. It doesn't mean you can't be out there recreating, but how close you are can really change their behavior. And so some of the things that we want to make sure you guys know is your sea otter behavior. So you can kind of see, and here's just two photographs that are pulled, and one's alert and one's relaxed. And so when you see behavior that's alert, head raised, eyes looking at you, tensed body, swimming away, that's all a sense that you have disrupted their behavior. Versus if you look at the photo on the right, that's relaxed, undisturbed. They're not looking at you, body's relaxed, calm, not swimming away. And these are just photographs. I mean, you can look through, there's plenty of photographs of disturbed otters out there. And I think what's hard is that we see these photographs and they look amazing because they're clear or you want to see a sea otter. But I think it's important for us to consider looking past just the photograph and making sure we're understanding the behavior that we see. So with Sea Otter Savvy, we do have some recommended guidelines. We really want people to make sure that you're aware of your surroundings, you watch their further behavior, and you maintain a respectful distance, okay? Sea otters do need space, and this is based on our research, but we know that 100 feet or 8 kayak lengths, you're in the green zone. You're good to go. Pass by parallel. It's safe for otters in most, but some in remote locations might be a little bit different. That's why it's important to watch for behavior. But generally, we like to say, please don't get closer than 60 feet or 5 kayak lengths. That becomes sort of a yellow zone for them. And then I just wanted to, the last thing I have to say is that we have Sea Otter Awareness Week coming up. The theme is Bridging the Gaps. And it's going to be a September 20th through 26th. So make sure you guys are following Morro Bay State Parks, follow us, Sea Otter Savvy. The schedule is going to be finalized and put up at the Defenders website. Yeah, and so I'm excited to, if we do have any questions off the YouTube site, I'm happy to answer them. And if they don't come in now, I'm happy to answer them afterwards as well if they come in later.
There are no questions on the YouTube page.
Okay. All right. Well, no worries. If they do come in, I can help you, Mariana, after, but thank you all for tuning in. I'll start my video and wave at you guys. It was really nice to be able to give you, that was a lot of information, and there is so much more. So if you do have questions, don't hesitate to ask, and you can always go follow us on Sea Otter Savvy as well and check out our pages, and we're happy to answer anything from there as well. But it was really nice to share this all with you guys, and I hope everyone enjoys the rest of their Biodiversity Week, and don't forget to tune in for Sea Otter Awareness Week, the last week of September. All right. Bye.